Good morning.
Muy buenos días. Antes de iniciar, yo quisiera recordarles que tendremos la sesión en español y en inglés el día de hoy. Nuestros amigos de México se expresarán en español y entonces si no tienen sus receptores de traducción simultánea, les rogamos que los consigan. Antes de comenzar, quisiéramos cambiar un poco las cosas. Quisiéramos que ustedes se presenten con el vecino que tengan al lado, por favor.
So,
La razón por la cual les pido que hagan eso es que uno de los desafíos que tenemos para el día de hoy es modificar nuestras conductas, nuestros comportamientos, y lo que les he pedido que hagan es algo pequeño que nos permite cambiar nuestros comportamientos en las reuniones. Al abordar nuestros temas, en particular los temas que se relacionan con la energía y en nuestra búsqueda de un camino sostenible hacia el futuro, de lo que estamos hablando realmente es de modificar nuestro comportamiento. Y hay cosas menores como aquella que acabamos de hacer que permiten avanzar aunque sea un poco. De manera que piensen en este tipo de cosas mientras sesionamos durante el
about
día
the
y
energy
mientras
problem.
consideramos el problema
So,
de la
I'm Bob
energía.
Fricklin with IHS CIRA, and what we're going to do today is have a dialogue around the new energy realities and around the new energy landscape. And if you start to think about the energy landscape that we're facing, we're really looking at another one of those global changes. Markets are changing. Everybody knows about the BRIC countries. But supply is changing, and in particular, in the Americas. In Latin America, we think about the major changes in supply that are going on. We have Brazil, of course, with its pre-salt, looking now to move from 2 million barrels, a little over 2 million barrels a day, to over 5 in the next 5 to 10 years. We look at Colombia, that's gone from producing 400,000 barrels a day to closing in on 1 million barrels a day. You look at Venezuela, that again has lots of potential and is moving up from its almost 2 million barrels a day and potential to move to 4. And of course, you look at the opportunities here in Mexico with the deep water. We look at Peru. So if you start to paint this picture, even with Argentina, with the shale oil, you get a continent that can be producing more than 10 million barrels a day once again. You put North America in this equation with the shale, or the tight oil as it's called nowadays, and you see potentially another 5 million barrels a day. So the Americas is a very strong emerging supplier, really. And this landscape is changing the way most of us in this room do business. We start thinking about petrochemicals now in places that we haven't for years. We start thinking about how that could be put on a downstream, thinking about agriculture in the region, places where we haven't seen any growth in agriculture. And you start to balance this, though, as we go forward and think about how do we do this sustainably. And we look at the big problems that come with supply being created in a new place. It means infrastructure in places that we've never had it before. It means a new footprint in places like the Amazon or in small cities, in the Llanos, or even here in Mexico in the deep water, where, if successful, a whole new area could be grown, and not to mention shale. So how do we balance this from a sustainable standpoint? How do we limit this footprint that's so large? This is what we want to discuss today in our panel in some ways, and how we balance who's going to do this investment. If we think of these projects, there's a lot of money involved. Brazil in the next 5 years is $250 billion, $50 billion a year. The shale in Argentina could could take more than $10 billion a year if that was to move forward. Deep water here, you could see huge amounts of money moving forward. But we have to remember that 80% of these resources are owned by the national governments and by the people in these countries. So they have certain needs for this rent as well. So how does that public-private balance work? So we're going to explore these questions today. Each of our panelists here is an expert in one field or the other around this particular topic. And then as I introduce them, we'll move forward in a question and answer style. So please, if you have a question in Spanish or in English, raise your hand and enter the discussion that we're going to have. So what I'd like to do first, we have the minister from Mexico here, Senor Jordi Herrera, and I'm going to start with a question for him. Really, if we think about things moving forward in Mexico here, and we look at really there's a balance that has to go between policy and sort of pragmatism. If maybe you could start us off with this sort of discussion quickly around, do we lead with policy or do we lead with science? How do we move forward?
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. For us, in the energy sector and in our government's administration, we take as a starting point a key question. Is the structural design of our energy sector in Mexico sufficient to meet the challenges that we have in our future? And basically incorporating two new variables that did not exist until relatively recently. One of these has to do with climate change and the response of the energy sector to greenhouse gas emissions, and secondly, having to do with energy safety or energy security in the various areas of our sector and for the subproducts that are needed by our sector. Mexico was becoming a net importer. And so the question was, did we have the structural design and the natural resources and the model for the future that would allow us to have a sustainable energy sector? And taking that as a starting point, we've been working on a transformation for what we have formally called the energy transformation for Mexico, to not be dependent on petroleum and to have a much more desirable and environmentally sound mix of energy resources, and to use all of the subsurface resources that are available to us in Mexico. I'll give you some examples. Before the Calderón administration, we only had 4 megawatts to a total capacity over 50,000 for wind energy. And we have developed wind energy resources to leave an installed capacity of 1,500 megawatts and projects for another 2,000, 2,300 megawatts. And this is in a very short period of time. Without these investments being necessarily from public treasury funds and without subsidies to have this development. This is one example of how, with a new outlook, a new vision, we're able to develop other energy resources. When it comes to hydrocarbon and petroleum resources, Mexico, up until 8 years ago, Mexico was the most expensive natural gas producing area. We were not exploiting the resources of our country for natural gas, and we have begun a very ambitious plan to develop both the infrastructure to transport natural gas throughout the breadth and length of the country, and connecting with the southern region of the United States, and to take advantage of our own resources. Mexico is one of the 5 countries having the greatest amount of natural gas resources in the country. This is a change of paradigm and will allow us to consume both in our refineries for our internal consumption processes as well as in the electrical sector in terms of generation. So this is what has thoroughly and absolutely changed the energy sector in our country. We stopped building LNG plants, and we're now looking to see how we can take advantage of our natural gas resources to create a large industrial gas and petrochemical sector where we're no longer a country in a deficit situation, but exporters. And the key to us is, in terms of the funds needed to develop this potential, the plan of Mexican petroleum resources is that we would need $25 billion over the next 10 years to be able to increase and reach a production of 3 million barrels a day in our country. If, in addition, Pemex was left to develop the shale gas, we would need another $10 billion in the same period of time. We're talking about amounts of $35 billion to be able to increase our crude production, an increase in gas production as well, and the transformation of these 2 products. But we're also working in this transition and transformation of our entire energy sector to intelligent savings on electricity. We've had programs that have been highly successful during the course of our administration, where we've lessened the intensity of use of our electrical energy resources with greater efficiencies, setting standards, for example, having to do with lighting. And there will be, from the market, also incandescent bulbs, energy-saving bulbs. Also, we're donating light bulbs to low-income families, new generation and efficient light bulbs, if they turn in their incandescent and less efficient, and these are destroyed in a sustainable program in terms of electrical appliances, air conditioners and refrigerators are being replaced. But we're thinking of this also in the larger scale with a very ambitious program of improvements in the facilities used by Mexican institutions like Pemex in cogeneration. For the first time, Pemex is going to generate electrical energy for its own consumption, but also for the grid. And this is from a cogeneration, a large cogeneration plant, 350,000 megawatts. And we're building the next generation of such plants. The advantages will be clear from being able to use these resources and also to be able to save on public treasury subsidies that will not be spent. And doubtless, to close the circle here, in terms of the environmental impact and the footprint from using less contaminating energy sources will be significant. We believe that the future of energy and of this energy transformation has to necessarily take advantage of natural gas, and the greater the restrictions related to climate change, will be taking much more significant decisions in terms of lessening the impact, the environmentally harmful impact from the use of fuels. And we began on this course thanks to the vision of President Calderon. The last point I would make is that Mexico has now a long-range 15-year plan that denotes what is the path for the energy sector. And when we look towards the year 2015, we see an energy sector that is more efficient, that is sustainable, and also ensures greater energy security when compared with just 5 years ago.
Thank you. So just out of curiosity, if you think out further 20 years out now, then what do you think the mix then will be here in Mexico from energy as far as renewables versus fossil fuels?
Hay un
An important information from the International Energy Agency, there'll be an increase of 40% in terms of the needs of installed capacity on the planet, and that same proportion, we believe, would apply to Mexico. This is an important challenge for us because we would need, for this same period of time, the capacity to increase 35%, not in terms of installed capacity, but in terms of production, in which we would not need to develop in that mix fossil fuel production. This is an important challenge. We, in terms of generation, are just above 20%. We would need to have a very significant increase then. And this is one example, by way of illustration. If that need to increase production, if we only were to use wind energy, we're talking about 5,000 megawatts. And of course, we'd also need some capacity because of the intermittent nature of the delivery of that energy. If it were just nuclear energy, that combination, we'd be talking about 8 reactors. At the end of the day, and to be able to meet this expectation in terms of the energy sector and to make it more sustainable in the future, we need to think of a energy mix, a hybrid, where given these restrictions of 35% of generation, we need to think in terms of nuclear energy plants for installed energy complemented with the most affordable in term level of renewable resources. How do we design that with public funds for our country without an increase in rates? So how do we seek this increase in terms of the cost of generation without this having an impact or being reflected in higher expenditures for consumers? And how would the subsidy of these rates affect this and also how do we meet the challenges of lower generation rates over the course of the same period of time? But we're convinced that this is the right path. These are the restrictions that we must meet because of the effects of climate change, quite independently of our own capacity for generation. This is where we're headed. We hope to be able to meet this challenge because we're planning, and our planning is already underway. I think any country that is not thinking in terms of its future energy needs on a 10 to 15 year time frame will find itself in an increase in rates that will reflect a lack of planning to meet the increase in energy demand.
Let's expand the conversation a little bit, and you picked up a lot on wind, so let me turn here to a gentleman who's been in the wind business really since the beginning, and he's worked on both mini as well as giant plants, and that's Eric Peterson, who's the CEO of Suzlon Wind Energy. So Eric, if you talk to us a little bit more about the overall footprint now in Latin America on wind. If we have it in Argentina, we have it in Mexico, where do you see the future of the wind business in Latin America?
Okay, thank you. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, from a renewable point of view, Latin America is actually doing great because of the hydros, but there's only so far very little wind capacity installed here, despite that you have a very good wind regime, particularly in Mexico, in Oaxaca, in Baja California, and a little further up north. So there's yet a lot Mexico can do to have some more renewable from the wind industry. It is naturally not a standalone because sometimes we have no wind, but it is a very, very good combination with the hydros because you can actually reduce the mix. When it's windy, you reduce the output from the hydros. So this is a perfect mix. The biggest installed base today, that's actually in Brazil, and they managed to really kick off 3 or 4 years ago. And this is actually what we can see is taking place currently in Mexico. And I think we need to thank the minister for, giving the possibility for allowing to be connected to the grid, that the legal framework will be in place. So IPP, which is private power producers, they can be able to connect to the grid, and they can do it on a commercial basis.
So you brought up a great question. So Brazil is leading, but why Brazil versus Argentina or Mexico? What was so different about their model?
I think they started the work on the legal framework before Mexico did. It's actually 12 years ago I started working on the first wind project in Mexico, but only now they are materializing, and that is, of course, due to the government here opening up the legal framework to connect. So it will also happen here. It's just a little delayed, according to Brazil, because the wind regime here is actually as good, even better in Oaxaca, where you can have a lot of full load hours, as we call it. That means the turbine is running full speed for many, many hours.
So let's expand the discussion a little bit to the power business itself, and we'll turn to really to Eric's left, and we'll ask one of our young leaders here, Marco de la Rosa, who's the Vice President for AES for Central America and the Caribbean. When you look at things from a power perspective, you have a portfolio that really is not just wind, it's everything. How are you making your choices of which particular power supply or fuel in the region? What do you see?
Well, what we see in Latin America, it's a very attractive area for investment in the energy sector. AES Corporation, or Fortune 2000, which has an important participation in the region in 8 important markets, including Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and other smaller markets, such as El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Panama, and Central America. We have all the energies, all the technologies, except nuclear, because of a corporate philosophy. But when we see the energy matrix in Latin America, it's true we have made significant progress. 28% of the energy matrix throughout the region is hydroelectric, in comparison with other continents, such as Europe, which only has 6% of hydroelectric. So we do have a competitive edge, which is very important. However, when we see the energy matrix, we see we still have a great dependence on petrol. 48% of the matrix throughout the region depends on petrol, oil. And a private enterprise such as us, when we enter a country, each market has its own particularities, but we try to change that energy matrix. And in that sense, we have two important challenges in the region. First of all, 6% of the population still has no access to electricity in Latin America. This represents more than 30 million people. And on the other hand, to try and work on implementing renewable energies. And now there's a great challenge in the region with the renewable energy. In our countries, the level of subsidies which is given to the energy sector is still very large. Countries such as Venezuela have allocated 9% of GDP to their energy subsidies. Other countries, perhaps smaller, such as Dominican Republic, have 3 or 4% of subsidies to the energy sector. So the basic challenge is to have cheap energy for the region, and we have used natural gas. which is the energy of the future. We have also invested in hydroelectric energy and invested in others such as solar or wind, aeolic, where it has a great installed capacity worldwide. We have 1,700 megawatts installed throughout the world. But in Latin America, we understand that the energy is to have cheap energy. And if we change the policy of subsidies in the region to more focused subsidies, and that these resources can then be invested in the resources needed in the region in order to install aeolic or solar energy, then we can work together with the public and the private sector, and that will decide our success in changing the energy matrix. Now, for the 5% of the population that today does not have access to electricity, we are facing yet another challenge. We have 8 companies, distributing companies in a region, and here it's fundamental to have public-private alliances in order to electrify or have power reach to rural areas. We have some very good examples, such as our companies in El Salvador, through alliances with the U.S. government or with USAID, have developed important projects, the same as in electric power in Sao Paulo. And this only makes sense if we work together. For the whole region, we have seen that in the next 10 years in the electrical sector, we require $400 billion in the next few years. And the challenge is how to attract these funds to the region, and we think the key is to have this alliance between the public and private sector.
Aldo Flores Quiroga, who is the Secretary General for the International Energy Forum, which really looks at a global perspective of the energy mix. How would you rate Latin America when it comes to its efforts relative to this conversion of the energy mix from renewables to fossil fuels?
Well, América Latina se ha convertido en la gran...
Latin America has become the great hope to strengthen the international energy, the reserves of fossil fuels. Its potential for renewable energy is changing. The outlook on interdependence itself, which is the basis of the international cooperation, this knowledge and interdependence. We are seeing that in Latin America, and I would say the whole American continent, is starting to provide serious, important examples on the development of these sources and the potential that the cooperation implies. I would like to highlight or bring out that there will be no progress in achieving energy security if we do not have knowledge of the market, of the working of the state, and the cooperation, international cooperation mechanisms. In the case of Latin America, the integration processes are allowing the development of these energies in a way that, if we, for example, look in Central America and Mexico, we have an expansion, increase in the grid, which is serving as a model for what we would like to achieve in Africa, to increase access to energy for those populations that are isolated. Good grief. Yes, energy security within the framework of this forum. Therefore, part of the Latin American model on the integration and cooperation can be used for other regions throughout the world. You had talked about the hope that this means for us, and it's a change in paradigm. And in Latin America, within the global context, Latin America has much to contribute because of its growing cooperation in the energy sector. From my viewpoint, I think Latin America should be more active in the global discussions in order to define the guidelines for cooperation between producers and consumers. The base of the energy dialogue, which is what I represent, I insist, is the interdependence, and there is much yet to achieve with a more close cooperation between the producers and the consumers.
On the global perspective, let me turn to Mark Spellman, who's the global head of strategy for Accenture. And Mark, you've done a lot of work as well in this particular area around looking at the future energy mix. And in particular, are we being realistic about the timing of how this is going to work? We had a challenge yesterday from our friends at Greenpeace, Marcelo Furtado, and he really said, we talk a lot, but what sort of time frame really should we be looking at?
Thanks, Bob. And let me just start by, I think, sort of framing it like this. One size doesn't fit all, and certainly when you look at it in Latin America. So it's very important that I think one doesn't sort of try and create too many sort of stereotypes, because each country, particularly in Latin America, has a different starting point. Some have real access challenges, others have more growth challenges. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. The second issue is that very often we look for silver bullets in energy. And the danger, I think, is that, for example, shale gas becomes the next silver bullet. And one of the key messages, I think, around energy and energy policy is that you have to look at it holistically. And that brings me on to the sort of the third point, which is that there are lots of whats out there around energy policy, but you really need to think about the hows and the roadmaps. And clearly, when you look at the roadmaps, we have to balance the supply side with the demand side. And so what you see very often is too siloed a discussion. So people look at certain aspects, for example, of the supply mix. So we're looking at what's happening around whether it's macro generation, i.e. big gas, or we're looking at sort of certain aspects of renewables. And it seems to me that we have to have a much more balanced debate. And the real issue around the timescale is how do you get the right balance? And that means that we need to look at big centralized fossil fuel driven supply side and generation with more micro generation. We need to look at the grids and the connectors, not just within country but cross country. And clearly energy efficiency is also hugely important. So it seems to me that the real issue in the debate and the question around the time frame is having a much more holistic approach so that we can look at drivers around growth and what is going to drive the growth in our economies. We look at issues around security, and we look at issues around sustainability. And we bring that together in a portfolio of levers which look at, for example, regulation and policy. It looks at technology. It looks at the role of the markets. And remember that markets have both positives and negatives. If you want markets, you need to let markets work. And the other key issue is around skills and particularly human capital. And I think what we need to do in terms of answering this question on timescales is look at all of those dimensions in a holistic way, both within country and across country. And I think if we do that, then we'll be able to come up with much more robust roadmaps than we've got today. And I think the last point I'll just make, Bob, is that too much of our focus is on the input side and not enough on the output side. And I think whether we're talking about regulators or we're talking about companies, we need to reward output. We need to reward success. We need to look at outcomes, whether that's in terms of reliability, safety, or service levels, much more focus on outcomes. And that is the mix which I think will answer the questions around time frame.
So yeah, I think that's a great point as far as the timing on investment, that we tend to forget often that this is very capital intensive business that we're in, particularly on a upfront basis. So maybe if I turn this question back to Minister Herrera, if you're you put together a picture here, a very nice one of the future but there's a lot of money. I got to about $50 billion pretty quickly with some of the numbers that you put forward. Obviously you need to find a balance between using the public's money, shall we say, and some private. What sort of steps do you see in Mexico that are going forward on the renewable side are, there are several models that have been put forward here recently by companies where they insist on contracts, for example, that those vendors have some sort of renewable portion in their bids or in their programs. They get certified in some sort of renewable way. What sort of things along that line do you envision here in Mexico?
Por su-
Well, of course, the greatest challenge that Mexico will be facing in the future is the legal framework that we have in the energy sector. In other words, where is the money going to come from in order to cover the energy needs that the country has in the future? So, supposing that the legal framework would prevail, even today, we have found the way of promoting, for example, in the case of renewable energy, without giving subsidies to production. We have a possibility of generation, which is called self-supply, which would allow an off-taker, a consumer, energy consumer, to have a generating plant. In this case, many companies are opting for renewable energy. And because of the differentials, the different rates between the provider, which is the public company, CF, and what can be obtained because of efficiency in this self-supply scheme, there are economic advantages for the consumer. In this way, we have been able to develop, as I mentioned in my first part, to have renewable energy. And of course, because in Oaxaca or in Baja California, we have exceptional quality of air, which allows us to have extraordinarily high factory quality. It allows us to be profitable. The problem is that as the need grows to have renewable energy in Mexico, we will exhaust the best areas in terms of plant or profitability, and we will arrive at a moment when we will have to decide between being able to meet the renewable goal, this 35% restriction, non-fossil fuel restriction that I mentioned, without subsidies, or to start subsidize in order to achieve that goal. But the public finances are notoriously insufficient to do this. So where can we find the resources in order to provide incentives to renewable energy? The consumption of the fossil fuels itself. In our country, we have, if we add all the subsidies that are given to the fossil fuels, we have pesos, 300,000 pesos, we're talking about $27 million a year, which would give us enough space. And if we have an equivalence, these subsidies are of the same amount as the budget that Mexican Petroleum has for 2012. It's a very large amount of money, which is distributed very inefficiently because it benefits someone who has a limousine the same as someone who has a very small work vehicle. They're both subsidized in the same way, and it's very inefficient. This restriction resources will then allow us to be more efficient in the distribution of public funds and to be able to focus these where there can be greater profitability and social profitability. We can together, we will have to together determine of the public funds that we have, how much we want to use in promoting renewable energy and how much will be used to subsidize the fossil fuel in a personalized manner or more focused manner so it can be more efficient. This is, as I mentioned, if there are no modifications or changes to the legal framework. What I think will happen is that these restrictions due to climate changes, this information that we have, that we can consider a fact that we're not going to be able to achieve the 2 degrees, will be above 2 degrees temperature increase, and the restriction itself of the availability of public funds will surely lead us to bring about a change, legal change that will include private funds and the energy sector. I don't know if it'll be short, long, medium, or long term, but the greater the restriction with regard to climate changes or public funds, then the reaction will have to be perhaps much quicker. But these are large resources that are needed that the state will not be able to cover indefinitely, and that will lead us to redesign the model, and of course with a very important factor, which is the savings and energy savings, which is of course a win-win situation for all the participants.
Maybe turn a little bit for a discussion around keeping that sort of theme of financing, or at least thinking about sort of the allocation of money into the renewable range. Obviously, with the power and the gentlemen that are up here, one question that comes to mind, though, is as you make your decisions around which particular fuel, and particularly Marco, to go forward with, how are you finding the finance world in these different countries? Is it just the interdevelopment banks or World Bank, or are you seeing a growth of more private financing going on, and companies willing to take this risk or this entrepreneurship?
Definitivamente un sector de capital.
Yes, a sector of intensive resource where we find millions of dollars is the financial sector, which supports this type of investments, and it would require a certain predictability. And this is one of the greatest challenges that we find in the region, how to implement public policies that will ensure the predictability, the stability that an investor requires long term. And of course, the quality of the off-taker is fundamental, depending on who's buying the power from the financial. Then the financial sector will, of course, assign lower or greater risk. And so in that sense, in countries where we have more structural challenges, we could carry out projects with an alliance with multilateral institutions that could support the energy sector. AES has a good record of working with multilateral institutions such as the IDB and World Bank, which support the energy sectors, not only by granting financing, but also providing technical support and regulatory frameworks that are stable and long-term. And so that the investor, this is what they require. There's another topic that we have not touched on, and I think it's one of the important challenges for the region, which has to do with the regional integration, the interconnection. And this happens not only in the energy sector. There are other examples, such as between Colombia and Venezuela. They have a commission, a gas line, and there are other examples in Central America and in the Caribbean, where we have the interconnection through CPAT, which unites all the countries of the region. So the challenge in financing for a company like us that would like to set up a 4,000 megawatt plant in the region would be how to make the regional policies and regulatory framework, how to make it coherent. And one of the challenges that we are facing in the region, I think it's been one of the reasons why this interconnection, regional interconnection that has been promoted since the 90s, has not been as successful as we would have liked due to the political economic crises of some of the countries involved. So how to ensure this coherence in the regulation of these regional interconnections so that when a private sector wants to seek financing with intensive capital, he can then supply that predictability or stability over long term that is needed when this sort of financing is provided.
Point, Marco, about the regional integration, and we talk a lot about it, and maybe it's worth a few more follow-ups on that. Let me turn to Mark for a second to talk a little bit about regional integration, because you brought up the point of really, we all speak Spanish more or less in this region, and we come from a very sort of culturally similar area, but yet we seem to have trouble when we start to think about these regional integrations. Is it really realistic think about regional integration, or maybe it's a scale thing?
Thanks. I think the issue is that we talk about regional integration. I think start first and foremost with sort of cross-border. I think it's a better way to think about it because, as I said in my opening remarks, I think that we've got different countries with very different sort of positions. So let's talk cross-border rather than big regional plans. I think secondly, let's build on what already exists. There are some good areas for cross-border cooperation. We've seen that with certain sort of already projects, and we should build on that. And the third thing I would say is going back a little bit to this financing point. I think we have to balance risk with finance and policy because what we need to recognize is, yes, we need the policy coherence, particularly if you're talking about cross-border cooperation, so that both sides or both countries are operating off the same sort of policy parameters. Clearly, we also need to have the right mix of finance, but you need to recognize the risk parameters. And clearly, there are different categories of risk depending on whether this is established or new technologies, the type of investment that you're trying to make. And getting the balance between the risk portfolio and the different sort of sources of funding are extremely important. So I think that cross-border is the way to think about it, and balancing policy, risk, and finance is the way that we should be looking to move forward.
So, Eric, what, from the wind standpoint, one of your big things of trying to make something work, shall we say, from a broader thing, is the transmission. So, what would you, if you had a shopping list or a thing going forward and you wanted to connect one of your areas, what's the scope that you could put together from the wind side?
Well, my shopping list will be a total integrated grid throughout Latin America, even going up to North America. This is actually what we have in Europe, and we have that despite different legal frameworks. So there are different PPAs in Germany, Denmark, Norway, but whenever it is windy in Denmark, we cannot consume that ourselves. On a windy day, we produce more energy from the turbines than we consume, and hence we are sending it down south or even up north. And the good thing is Norway, Sweden, they have the hydros, and then they just put down the hydro output and then they consume the power. But the PPA, which is the power purchase price, it is guaranteed from the states itself. So the producer, they don't care where the power is going, if it's going to Germany, the Netherlands, or even down to Italy. We have trading companies sitting, actually, if Bulgaria, they are running short, then they can, within fraction of seconds, they can open up and distribute the power all over Europe. Eventually, that will also go into Russia. So I think this is a model which can be applied in the American continent, so to speak.
So before I do a follow-up, are there any questions from the audience? Or can we get a microphone up front, please? Please, Cesar.
Yes, my name is Cesar Ortiz Sotelo from GDF Suez. We are very active in the region in Latin America, and I have one question, primarily to Minister Herrera, but also to the other panelists. I have not heard the word carbon pricing in any of the speeches. I understand there is a need to go green, to go, more renewables, but this issue of putting a price to carbon has not come up somehow in the discussion. When we talk of integration, we talk maybe just by two countries putting their systems and regulations in a coherent way. Carbon pricing, or carbon at least, the issue of carbon must be there somewhere.
De alguna manera,
And we have touched on this point in two ways. First, the elimination of the subsidies for fossil fuels is to recognize the cost, the real and formal cost of each of the fuels. This would be the first step. The second, for me, is linked to the critical of the global warming or the greenhouse effect gases, how critical these are. It's not as simple as supposing that the planet will increase more than 2 degrees in a century. And as when we are, the further away we are from these 2 degrees, then there'll be an incentive to tax the consumption of fossil fuels. I mean, that's natural. That is what economically will happen in order to reach a balance. That is why it is important, as I mentioned, to plan from now. Now, the economies, and especially the Latin American economies, where we have a great abundance of natural resources, hydrocarbons, and natural for renewable energy. If we now design the energy sector, taking into account the climate change will be an economic restriction over time, because sooner or later there will be a tax on the consumption of fossil fuel, then we can prepare ourselves so that this cost of adaptation, which is what it will be called, can be diluted over time to an economy that has not planned its energy sector, and in a lapse of 10, 15, 20 years will have to make a very expensive transformation because it did not diversify its basic basket of energy. That is why it is important to start now with the energy transition. And every energy transition requires a fuel. I am convinced it is natural gas. It could be either conventional or non-conventional. But the competitive advantage that a country could have now with the prices, at least with North America, with the prices of gas, gives us a unique opportunity to attract investments, to be competitive, and to start thinking about the energy mix we will need in the future. The countries that, because of their natural resources or because availability of financial resources, can jump ahead to this transition and stop depending on fossil fuel, these will be the winners in this century. I'm convinced of that. And besides the information that we have from the climate change, I mean, that's the way it's going. And this also has to do with the energy efficiency. We're not only trying to generate a more sustainable resource, but to have a more rational consumption. And we have to work together with this. We have to work on the supply side, but also on the demand side, and to change the way we as humans are consuming. That is why it's so important to have the same standards. It's not the same for a country, an isolated country such as Mexico, to determine that they will no longer use incandescent lights. A global decision would make the market change, and that's what this is about. Or with vehicles, for example. When there are much more formal agreements to stop consuming ordinary fuel and to use hybrid or electric, then that will change the pattern of consumption and it will change the economics of the industry. That is why it's important to have global integration processes that will allow a more quick flow towards the energy change that we need here on the planet. But those that are jumping ahead and doing things now will have that competitive edge in the future.
I think I pulled out of what you were just talking about, where one is that be careful about governments picking the winners as we move forward and let the markets do this, but at the same time you need to provide the framework that this goes forward in a logical way. Now, Aldo, you've been looking at this, I know, a little bit within your organization. What sort of comments might you have?
Un par de puntos a destacar.
A couple of points to note. The other issue that hasn't been a part of our discussion, in addition to the carbon price, is clean energy. And I don't want to dampen the mood here, but the energy future has a very clean, has a very large component of fossil fuels, and the challenge, the real challenge, has to do with how we create a transition on the basis of clean energy, as the Secretary has said. And if we don't establish a financing scheme it's going to be difficult to change the fossil fuels sector into something that is environmentally friendly. And within the international discussion on this, there are lots of efforts in terms of the sequestration and capture of carbon, and we're trying to understand under what terms we can have examples to use internationally as models. There is still lots to be developed here in Latin America. Europe is further ahead on this. So it's important for us to think in terms of a clean energy future that we desire for the energy sector, in terms of diversification of the mix, of the matrix, and a very wise selection of public policies. To date, the first country that has bet on the first country to bet on clean energy is going to be very relevant, and we need to be attentive to all of the energy sources.
Again, I think we're picking up sort of the same theme around something about the winners in the future and who are the early adapters to this. Let me go back to the question, though, that was from the floor, a little bit about the price of carbon. I know, Mark, you've done some work around carbon markets and a little bit in Europe, and we've seen the model once in Europe. Doesn't seem to have gotten very far. So maybe, Mark, what do we need to do to get this going? Or
well, like all markets, they need demand and supply, and if you put too much supply into the system, then the price collapses. And I think the message from particularly the emissions trading scheme in Europe was that there were, I think the principles were good, but there were some fundamental flaws, particularly in terms of the supply. And I think if you look at it like a pilot and an experiment, I think what you ultimately have to do is to think about what is the minimum price that you need in order to create changes in behavior. Go back to one of the points that you were making right up front. That gets you into a whole sort of series of questions around sort of the supply side and how generous you are, particularly to certain industries around permitting and auctioning. And then questions, obviously, about how do you create equity across multiple countries, particularly in Europe. So I think that we're seeing Europe particularly as an experiment. I think realistically, though, we are not going to get a coherent global scheme on carbon pricing in the foreseeable future. So what we're going to see is a patchwork of, I think, different pilots taking part in different parts of the world. And I think that we need to recognize that that is what is going to happen. And businesses and governments are going to have to work within a patchwork system. And then that will influence, obviously, go back to one of our other points about the speed at which some certain things will happen. But that's the reality of where we are, I think, because it's very difficult. I think we have to recognize this is a decade of transition. And in a decade of transition, you don't get all the governance right, you don't get all the principles right, but you can begin to see the seeds of what is happening and directionally where things are going. And obviously governments and businesses and NGOs have to work within those sort of broader parameters. So my message to everybody, including business, is that this is a decade of transition. Recognize it as such. There won't be a definitive carbon price, but you can see directionally where things are going in certain parts of the world, and therefore work within that and factor that into the decision-making process.
so that's great. I think, again, we're sort of looking at this time frame of transition, but let's switch and talk to the two gentlemen that really make a lot of their decisions based on pricing. In particular, let's start off with Marco. And you know, as you go through your entry strategy to some of these markets, you're comparing price on all of the different tools you have in your portfolio. What other things besides just direct price? You look at the length of the subsidy. What's driving these decisions? Is it purely price, or?
No, en cuanto al tema del
In terms of the carbon price, I think we have to differentiate into whether a project is affordable or not. And when we look at the long-term affordability and whether we can have credits for blocks of energy might make a project much more affordable. So I think the question is on point and has to be taken into account. Now, it isn't just a question of price as the fundamental factor of using one technology or another. I think we also need to think in terms of private investment and whether we can ensure the long-term capital flows necessary, and the decision for one technology or another might change based on that. In terms of natural gas, and I think this is a relevant issue for Latin America, we have to separate producer countries from importer countries. Clearly, the region has very advantageous circumstances. Producer countries like Mexico, like Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, of course, have in their energy matrix, and they will continue to incorporate greater amounts of natural gas. But countries that are not producers might be able to join this group in terms of an evolution of technology that will allow producer countries to match the demand from other countries. 7 times the capacity of transportation of energy is possible through the use of liquid natural gas, for example. So all of this technological development, together with the fact that the United States will very soon be exporting gas and giving priority to countries with which it has free trade agreements, many of them in Latin America, this is going to be a very significant change in the energy matrix of the future. In a report of the Inter-American Development Bank, we noted that 70% of the energy matrix of Latin America over the next 20 years will be a mix of hydroelectricity and natural gas. And that's, I think, where we're headed.
You bring up a couple of very good points. One, of course, of maybe there is another model with the producer. If we look at the regional integration, maybe the producers and consumer countries can get to better. And also, you point out a little bit about sort of the technology issue. And I want to get back to the technology here just really quick with Eric, and then we have 2 questions from the floor that we'll get to in a second. Or sorry, 3. So Eric, would you just quickly,
I'll just like to
from
add,
a technology standpoint, what sort of thing do you need to move forward in a game changer to make, wind is competitive now in many places, but what will make you more competitive?
Well, I think that the technology is improving day by day. If you go 10 years back, then the efficiency of the wind turbines at that time was very limited. But due to new composites, lighter materials, bigger rotors, etc., we pick up much more wind, and hence wind energy today, it is competitive. It is even competitive if you're talking about nuclear, because if you take the life cycle cost, you also have to think about, you have to demolish the nuke and you have to store the fuel. So if you do a true calculation, then I believe wind energy will come out as a winner. Having said that, talking about the carbon certificate, which was a big trade in Europe, but it has dropped. I can tell you out of the more or less 20,000 gigawatt of Sussel installed turbines worldwide, hardly 1 or 2% of those projects are depending on carbon trade.
Great. So let's start here in the front, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. My question is really for Secretary Herrera, and it is a follow-up from the earlier comment. I first mentioned that my name is Carla, and I'm here from the Asian Development Bank, but here with the YGL community, and I work on the Energy Task Force there. So Secretary Herrera, it was a pleasure for us yesterday to listen to your president who spoke about climate change as one of the world's #1 priorities and his priority in doing changes there. And you echoed those remarks this morning. We heard the discussion on subsidies and you saying they need to be removed. I was wondering how Mexico may try and push that agenda through the G20, and given that the G20 in 2010 had agreed to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. So first that comment and question, and then a brief comment. There was an earlier discussion on regulatory coherence and cross-border and trade. In Asia, we deal with cross-border through contractual agreements, but we've initiated an ASEAN Energy Regulators Network to actually deal with those interconnection issues, and it may be something that might be useful to think about here too. Thank you.
En el diseño.
In deciding public policies within the administration of President Calderon, there were two key criteria: how human beings relate to the public policies and the sustainability of the model in terms of natural resources. So in the specific case of subsidies, I'd like to begin by something that maybe we took for granted and we considered it obvious in our discussion here. Public policies that do not have a positive effect on citizens are not good public policies. The fact that we are thinking in terms of a diminishing level of subsidies for fossil fuels, how do we conceive this in terms of the benefits and the effect on Mexican citizens? So let's talk about lower income families or households that consume LNG, which is the most common situation for poor families and that don't even have an automobile. The government today is subsidizing LNG, LP, because we realize that because of their income level, we're not able to take away that subsidy. It would be for them and for the environment that they stop consuming LP and start using wood. Let's say wood for fire that or for fuel that they can find in their own environment. So the subsidies here have to take into account the fact that the state must continue supporting the more than 50 million Mexicans who are continuing in their struggle to leave their conditions of poverty. Secondly, if we move to the families and households that are no longer considered at the poverty level, but probably consume a different kind of fuel, for example, gasoline, we are benefiting them in the same proportion, those who have a small vehicle, than those who have, as compared with those who have 2 or 3 automobiles in their family or in their household. So it's very inefficient to give generalized subsidies without being able to determine what the benefit individually is to the household in terms of income. So the spirit of this measure must be that those who have sufficient disposable income pay for the real cost of fuel. And the Mexican state has no reason to subsidize those households with higher incomes, but needs to maintain its position of support and solidarity with those with lower incomes. This doesn't mean that from one day to the next you're going to take away a subsidy entirely, but that it needs to be a gradual measure that over the long course and seen as a whole, the public policy is also sustainable. It can't be eliminated so as to have pernicious effects on the environment as well. So what we're looking for in the end is to spending the least amount of public funds to subsidize fossil fuels and to free up resources that can be used exclusively when we think in terms of the energy sector for creation of new infrastructure that is sustainable and that may also be spent on other resources, other forms of energy resources. So there must be a social sustainability and also must differentiate between those with different levels of income. Once we have reached the true market price of fossil fuels, then public policy can differentiate in terms of the market. Today, if we think only in terms of gasoline at $17 billion a year, this has no economic sense and is not focused and does not give us a clear social return. So we need to gradually modify the parameters for the way these resources are allocated within the agenda of the G20, recognizing that there are different criteria and different situations for all of the countries that make up the G20. We need to know what the real cost is for fossil fuel energy, so that from that, as a starting point, we can have public policies in each of our countries to allow a sustainable model that will last over time. I think this is a clear necessity. We have seen experiences in African countries that, due to the energy crisis in the previous year and in this year, began implementing policies from one day to the next that were absolute failures. But I think this is the correct course of action, to follow the market signals and to adapt public policies to the greenhouse gas and the climate change circumstances, but that also shows which path we are going to follow. I think this allows us to use market information to make efficient decisions in terms of the distribution of resources.
So I think, well, we're out of time, so the last two questions that we had, if you could see the panelists afterwards, because we are out of time. But that's a great, really, summary almost of some of the issues that we were looking at today and some of the going forward as we think about really these paradigms that we're working on. One is really around energy, affordable energy for all, and how we pay that. Another really is this regional integration issue, which I think what the outcome today is really, let's not think too big when we do that. Mexico has a plan actually right now, right, we're integrating some of the smaller communities. So maybe it's really these smaller steps that we need to do. The other thing that we looked at a lot was in Latin America, we call it Latin America, but we have to remember that the countries are all different. There are differences in all of them, and that therefore it is a little harder to really to put everything in one bucket, even though we talk about it in one bucket. And quite frankly, as we move forward, this public versus private spending is still a big paradigm that we have a ways to go to work out. But one of the kind of the last thing really is around, very clearly stated by the minister, is around being very careful that policy does not choose the long-term winner as we look forward in this vision of energy. And I think just the way we started today, that in many ways a good way to end, in that if you think of the generation of many of you look to be similar age to some of us up here, have kids who are very much attuned to changing the behavior. Where the gap is really between those that are around 30 and up to some of us gray hairs, and getting us to change our behavior. So think of those small things like we started with, and think about that in the energy business. So please join me in thanking the panelists today and in engaging in this discussion and helping us move us forward. And I'm sure that if those of you that didn't get your questions, could please talk to them afterwards. Thank you.